Welcome to AskPsychSessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thanks for joining us today. Our guest is Dr. Derek Avery from the University of Houston. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
So before we jump in, as usual, I like our listeners to know a bit about who they're going to hear from today. Could you tell us about the type of courses you teach at Houston and a bit about your own research and professional background, please?
Sure. So at the University of Houston, I teach courses primarily in the area of diversity management, human resources, and organizational behavior. I teach doctoral students, I teach MBAs, I teach undergrads. By training, I am an industrial and organizational psychologist. Got my undergraduate degree in psychology from Tulane University, my master's and PhD from Rice University in Houston. Go Owls, go Green Wave. And I am a native Louisianian, which definitely skews my perspective on life. So I always like to tell people about that before they listen to me talk about it.
Well, maybe we'll talk about that and how it rubs up against my native Ohioan, but now 15 years of New Jerseyan-ness, which doesn't always feel like it overlaps seamlessly. So I might be wrong, but I think you are one of the first industrial organizational psychologists that I've had a chance to chat with. And I wanted to bring you on because we had a listener write in with a question. So just a reminder, if you have questions, we're always looking to answer them, asking about IO psychology and an intro psych course. And their question was more, should it be included? But my answer would be probably yes, given who at least my students are and what they're going to do, and given who your students are. So would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about why IO would be valuable in an intro psych course and what you might suggest including, recognizing that, you can't make the whole class IO psych, but maybe if you would suggest a little less Freud and a little more fill in the blank, you tell us.
So given that an intro to psychology class is designed to be a survey class, my answer to should IO be included is an absolute yes, definitely. We like to believe that we are one of the areas of psychology, and as such, we would definitely love to see our perspectives and our science represented as students are being socialized and exposed to the various aspects of the field. In terms of what should be covered, that gets a little bit trickier given academic freedom, right? So people have the right and the ability to cover things in the way that they see fit, and that makes things a little bit tricky, given that the folks teaching intro to psychology courses are often not IO psychologists and oftentimes don't have a great deal of familiarity with IO psychology. I think one of the reasons why it's important to have IO in an intro class, in addition to continuing to facilitate interest within folks who might pursue careers in psychology, is that a fundamental understanding of IO is potentially useful to anyone who's going to work professionally because they need to understand things like motivation. They need to understand things like leadership. They need to understand things like compensation in order to make sense of the world that's around them, or in order to make sense of the world that they attempt to organize if they take on any entrepreneurial pursuits and try and develop their own business and build that up. So I think that having that fundamental understanding of what IO is useful for anyone who intends to have a job at some point.
Great. Thank you. You're right. Those are words that feel important, definitely for people that plan to have careers, but then, also some of them sound incredibly relevant to what I want to have happen in my classrooms, which I've come to realize lately is I understand how memory works, but I want my students to feel motivated to do the things that will help them, right? I can talk about the testing effect all day, but motivation almost feels like something that needs to come first. Do you feel up for maybe talking a little bit about how you and your classrooms use your own knowledge around things like motivation to help create a successful space for learning?
Oh, absolutely. So, for instance, one of the things that I do is I draw a parallel between the syllabus and an employment contract. And I talk to students about how ridiculous it would be to sign up for a job and not actually read your contract. And yet it's actually quite commonplace for people to take a class and then never actually read the syllabus. So I have some colleagues who have gone so far as to have their students sign off that they have read and received the syllabus. The thing that I do is I tell students that the syllabus is fair game for questions on exams. So they will routinely get questions on their test that allow them to demonstrate that they either read the syllabus and understood the content or they didn't. In large part because that is this overarching document that is designed to govern the relationship between them and the class. So it lets them know what's expected of them so that they have this realistic set of expectations where they can either self-select in or self-select out. It also dictates how they should be spending their time. And it helps to dictate what the exchange relationship is going to be. If you do this, you will get this in return. If you don't do this, here are the penalties that are associated with that so that they understand all of the contingencies that are involved. But perhaps most importantly, I think that it helps to dictate the rules of engagement, right? So that they understand these are the ways in which I'm expecting you to invest your time and talents in this course, right? And so then, something like motivation becomes clearer in terms of how they are expected to demonstrate their degree of motivation within the classroom. So they know that doing these things, so for instance, preparing for class means X, Y, and Z. So I'm very clear in stipulating these are the things that I'm looking for that help to demonstrate your level of preparation when you walk into my classroom. And to the extent that I don't see those things, and they may be imperfect indicators, right? So I'm very clear about that as well. But it just allows me to draw some parallels so that they understand that the process of appraising their performance within the classroom very nicely parallels that which they're going to be exposed to post-university, right? When they're out in the workforce and they're being assessed by their bosses. And so they need to understand these are sort of the rules of engagement regarding assessment. Here are the things that people are paying attention to. These are the things that people are watching. Here's how you engage in impression management so that you can make sure that people are seeing the things that you want them to see and that you're emphasizing the things that you want emphasized so that the perceptions of you are consistent with the way in which you view yourself and want to project yourself.
Great. Thank you. I imagine that, I'm still tweaking my syllabus right now, although by the time that comes out, I think just our colleagues on the quarter system will still have a chance to maybe think about bringing some of that in. But that is helpful perspective. Another question that I wanted to ask, if you're up for it, is you're teaching not in a department of psychology, but in a business school. And so I think most of our listeners probably are in psych departments. Are you willing to share kind of some secrets that business might be harboring that might help us in psychology, or maybe some things about in business that we could bring into our courses that students might find interesting and engaging? And again, keeping in mind, I know you mentioned you have PhD students, but when you're teaching undergrads or MBAs, I assume these are people that are going to have careers in the private sector, right? To quote Ghostbusters, where they expect results. So what are some things that maybe we could bring in?
I think that anything that we can do to help frame things that we're going to discuss in the context of our courses in a light where students are immediately able to see the applications to their own lives is immensely meaningful. As someone who has taught both in a psych department and in a business school, one of the clear contrasts between the two is folks in psychology are often thinking about additional schooling. And folks in the business school are almost never thinking about additional schooling in their immediate future. They may at some point say, yeah, I think that down the road, I'm going to want to get an MBA. But they see their university training as preparing them for the immediacy of a career in corporate. And so when I frame things within that context, I have to make sure that I emphasize, hey, here's the utility of this information in the next 4 years, right? as opposed to just focusing on things that are abstract and that focus on their ability to think about these concepts and, conceptualizing and being creative. And, everything needs to have an applied emphasis. And so that can be frustrating, but it's also empowering, right? Because I know that in order to sell this, all I have to do is explain to them, here's how this adds value. Here's how this makes you more marketable. Here's how this, increases your ability to be impactful and effective within the workplace. And I think that within psychology, we can utilize that as well, especially in times when people are a bit nervous about the job market, when they're a bit concerned about what their prospects are going to look like. I think that one thing that we as psychologists need to do is we need to do a better job of representing the value of our science in these applied contexts. Because almost everything that other people study is applied psychology, right? So I tell people all the time, if you're studying marketing, that's applied psychology. If you're studying finance, particularly you're looking at the behavioral elements of it, that's applied psychology, right? If you're trying to understand the stock market, that's psychology, because it's all people who are making these decisions that make the market either go up or go down. So I think that it then becomes incumbent upon us to not just focus on psychology from the lenses that are most salient to us, but also think about how we can make psychology applicable through the lenses that are most important and relevant to our students. We have to meet them where they are.
Well, I think that meeting people where they are is a great way to think about coming into another uncertain semester. But I do always like to let my guests have a chance to talk about what they want to talk about. I asked you to talk about IO Psych, but is there anything else that you would like to talk to primarily teachers of psychology that you would want them to know, or that your sort of hopes for change, besides maybe not in faculty meetings insisting everyone's discipline is psychology? I was thinking, you must not say that in faculty meetings, right? Like marketing, we're going to rename you to applied psychology and finance. But is there anything else you'd like to add for our listeners?
Well, as someone who does research and primarily in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I always think about things that I talk about with that in the back of my mind. It's the lens through which I view almost everything. And so in having this conversation, it certainly makes me think about not just the importance of helping folks who are taking intro psychology classes be exposed to IO, but also thinking about the way in which we grow psychology in general. Businesses are really, their survival is contingent upon their ability to understand where are the untapped markets and how do we access those, right? Because if we don't have great access to those untapped markets, then growth becomes really difficult to generate and sustain. Careers need to think about that similarly. And in psychology, one of the things that is often frustrating to me is that I will run into students who are older. They may be 23, 24, 25, and they're coming back to get a second degree, or they're coming back to get a master's. And one of the things that they'll say to me is, I wish I had known about IO psychology. And oftentimes those students look like me. And I think to myself, wow, how are we missing the mark so broadly that there is this consistent feedback among folks, particularly within the underrepresented minority communities, who are saying, boy, I wish I had known that there was this thing called IO psychology, right? And they've taken these haphazard career paths that have ultimately led them here, where they started off, in accounting. And then they said, but I've always been interested in people, and I didn't realize that, I could do this thing that's sort of at the intersection between psychology and business, because within many minority communities, there are only certain majors that are considered acceptable, right? You're either going to be pre-law, you're going to be pre-med, or you're going to go into engineering, right? And if you choose something outside of that, then it's like, okay, well, that thing needs to help prepare you for a job immediately. And so then people go, okay, well, what about the business school? And when they find out that there is this thing called human resources, where a lot of psychology people, end up, or when they realize how applicable psychology is to a space like marketing, they go, oh my gosh, I wish I had realized that I could integrate business and psychology. Then I would have done, what I wanted to do in undergrad instead of doing what I thought that I had to do in order to get some of the things out of life that I wanted to get. So I think that anything that we can do that makes our science more widespread in terms of its reach, so that people understand, hey, these are all the things that you can do with psychology. And we're reaching out beyond just the people who traditionally tend to take our classes. So one of the things that the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology has done over the years is we have at times been more, and sometimes unfortunately less, but at times we've been more motivated to do outreach campaigns where we go out to Hispanic serving institutions or historically Black colleges and universities where there often isn't an IO psychologist there. And so the person teaching intro psychology is really limited in terms of their ability to accurately convey what the field entails. And so having a guest lecturer who is an IO psychologist be able to come in and say, hey, in addition to clinical, in addition to counseling, in addition to school psychology, there's also this thing called IO psychology, and you should be aware that this is out here. It is amazing how much interest that tends to generate. And then it just becomes a matter of helping people to prepare, right? So that they're not the typical, oh, I came in pre-med, I destroyed my GPA before I realized that I didn't want to be a doctor, and now is there a way for me to get into graduate school?
That is great. I don't teach intro, but I'm thinking about the ways that this might intersect with my cognitive psych lab, because certainly a lot of applied memory work would fit in with what you were talking about. So off to edit that syllabus based on that recommendation. And I really like what you said about outreach, and that the SIOP, right, the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, that you were referencing, that was how, I should also be honest, that was how I found you, right? When someone asked this question, I said, well, I'm going to go to the APA division that does IO Psych, and I found you on the leadership there. So thank you for your work in that space. And just generally, thank you. This has been a really engaging conversation for me, and I think that the listeners will also take some good nuggets from it, and hopefully we'll not have someone ask this in a year, because we'll see a shift that students will come into an IO Psych class knowing what it's about. I wish you a very successful semester, and thank you for your time. I've been chatting with Dr. Derek Avery from the University of Houston. Listeners, did today's episode make you realize you have a question you would like someone to answer? I would be happy to take it into consideration and find a guest that can help. But what I need you to do is head over to our Google form at bit.ly/AskPsychSessions.